بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with the muhadhab min ihya ulum al-din by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, and the muhadhib being a Sheikh Salih al-Shami. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, alive or whether transitioned into the next life. And so we come to Sihhatul Sawmi 'inda al-Fuqaha. So in this section we're going to talk about the validity of fasting amongst the fuqaha. Why? Because we have been speaking about fasting from a spiritual perspective, and we spoke about the purpose behind fasting and the fact that fasting has many spiritual components that need to be contended with in order for a person to acquire the taqwa, which is the purpose behind the fast. And so now Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he asks a question. He says, فَإِن قُلْتَ فَمَنْ اقْتَصَرَ عَلَى كَفِّ شَهْوَةِ الْبَطْنِ وَالْفَرْجِ وَتَرَكَ هَذِهِ الْمَعَانِي فَقَدْ قَالَ الْفُقَهَاء صَوْمُهُ صَحِيحٌ فَمَا مَعْنَاهُ. So he says, if you are to say that the fuqaha, the scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, they have mentioned that if a person were to simply abstain from the indulgences of the stomach and the private parts, and they were not to take into consideration the ma'ani which have been mentioned previously. So for those of you that weren't here, the ma'ani being, in brief, to protect the limbs, the heart, etc., from engaging in haram and from the dunya, and to focus totally and holistically on Allah Azza wa Jal and cutting ties with this worldly life. He says, if you look at the books of fiqh, the scholars of fiqh, they do not mention any of this. They say simply to stop eating and drinking and engaging in intimacy from daybreak until sundown. That's enough for your fast to be valid. He says, so where do we get this from? So he says, فما معناه, he says, فاعلم أن فقهاء الظاهر يثبتون شروط الظاهر بأدلة هي أضعف من هذه الأدلة التي أوردناها في هذه الشروط الباطنة. He says, you have to understand and you have to know that the ulama, the fuqaha, they focus on the zahir, and he calls them fuqaha al-zahir. Fuqaha al-zahir meaning the fuqaha of, and a faqih is the one who has understanding and comprehension, but Islamically it became known for the one who specializes in Islamic jurisprudence. He says that they focus on that which is apparent and external, and the evidences for which they have set the conditions for a valid fast are in fact weaker than the evidences that we have mentioned when it comes to the internal aspects of fasting. So what's he saying? He's saying that if they are referring to external aspects of fasting when talking about the validity, and the evidences that they are using are weaker than the evidences that we have used for the internal aspects of fasting, then likewise the internal aspects of fasting should be considered just as important. And he says, لا سيما الغيبة وأمثالها. So he says, especially such as ghiba, backbiting, and that which is similar to backbiting. And he's going to mention later on some. We can go back and look at the evidences if we need to, inshallah. But the evidence for the one who backbites, the evidence for the one who slanders, the evidence for the one who is eating from haram but fasting, i.e. his sustenance is haram, and so on and so forth. He says, ولكن ليس إلى فقهاء الظاهر من التكليفات إلا ما يتيسر على عموم الغافلين المقبلين على الدنيا الدخول تحته. So he says the fuqaha of the zahir, the scholars and ulama who only focus on the worldly life, i.e. your prayer is accepted as long as you have the tahiyyatul salah, Allahu Akbar, you have Fatiha, you have a small surah, you have the ruku', you have the sujood, and so on and so forth. Your salah, according to them, is valid whether you are a Muslim, a mu'min, or a munafiq, if you do the conditions of the salah. That's what he's saying basically, as they do not have jurisprudence over what? The heart and that which is internal, nor do they try to regulate that area. Their area of regulation is simply that which is external. Likewise in fasting, he says and their jurisprudence only relates to, the jurisdiction that they are engaged in only relates to that which al-ghafilin al-muqbilin ala dunya find easy to do. Al-ghafilin, what's the ghafil? The one who is basically
unaware.
Yeah, unaware. So al-ghafil, there are, al-ghafla can be good and can be bad. Al-ghafla an al-akhirah, al-ghafla an Allah is negative. Al-ghafla an al-dunya and al-taghaful, positive. And just for the discussion, as we're mentioning the word, al-taghaful is a key ingredient for a successful marriage and for a successful relationship with children. What's al-taghaful? To be overlooking, not to pick up on every small minor issue, which some in particular men unfortunately do, and women likewise they do. Everything is, there is a criticism for everything. Likewise with children, picking up on everything negative that they do. This is not the correct manner to build a relationship. So they put the mic up a little bit. So that's not the correct manner to engage in a relationship. At-taghaful is very important. But here, ghafla means to be unaware, to be in a state of unawareness, lack of concern, to be pre-engaged or concerned with something else, etc. So al-ghafilin here, anillah wa anil akhirah, al-muqbilin ala dunya, those who are turning towards this life and they are focusing on this worldly life. Sorry, if the brothers who, can they just turn the mic down please? If you can leave it to Bilal because it's causing feedback. So al-ghafilin, al-muqbilin ala dunya, الدخول تحته. So they only concern themselves with that which is relatable to the awam basically. He says فأما علماء الآخرة فيعنون بالصحة القبول وبالقبول الوصول إلى المقصود. He says as for the ulama of the akhirah, the ulama that focus on the purpose behind worship, the ulama that focus on al-akhirah, they are focused on what? The acceptance of the act from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not the validity of the act from the perspective of the onlooker. Ulama al-akhirah, they focus on the acceptance of the act from who? From the perspective of Allah Azza wa Jal. Ulama al-dunya, they focus on the acceptance of the act from whose perspective? The onlooker. You see someone pray, you say, oh, that's correct. You see someone fast, you say, that's correct. Why? Because of their external acts. But ulama al-akhirah, they are concerned with what? The internal aspects that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of. Only Allah knows. They focus on those areas. How can you gain acceptance from those areas? For example, if you pray at-tahajjud and you have wudu and you start with takbirat al-ihram and you end with the salam and you pray an odd number and so on and so forth, and you ask a faqih and you go through the conditions, he'll say it's acceptable. But if you go about telling people about it and gloating and boasting, etc., ulama al-akhirah, they'll tell you it's invalid. They'll tell you, in fact, this is a problem. It's better for you not to pray. Why? Because not only will it not be accepted, but it could be a means of being held accountable by Allah Azza wa Jal. And so ulama al-akhirah, they focus on the internal aspects. So he's saying, علماء الآخرة يعنون بالقبول الوصول إلى المقصود. When the ulama of the akhirah, they say that it's something is acceptable, they mean by that it will take you to the goal that you're trying to reach. ويفهمون أن المقصود من الصوم الاقتداء بالملائكة. And they understand that the goal behind fasting is what? Is to follow in the methodology or the way of living of the angels. How so? في الكف عن الشهوات بحسب الإمكان. How so? By way of abstaining from desires to the best of one's ability. فإنهم منزهون عن الشهوات. Why? Because angels, unlike men, they are above desire. They don't have desire the way that we have desire. They do not have the ability to follow or to say no. They are created in a way where they obey without question. That's the way they have been created. Just as water has been created to flow, angels have been created to obey. Just as man has been created with choice, angels have been created without the choice when it comes to desire, when it comes to listening and so on and so forth. And that's what is referred to as a taklif. Takliful insan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given insan a certain responsibility. What is that responsibility? The ability to say yes or the ability to say no. What gets in the way? Desire. And so the purpose behind fasting is to train oneself in saying what? No. And that is the conundrum of modern society. We have been conditioned and we have been trained to say yes. Why? Because it's good for the economy, it's good for the capitalist, it's good for the profiteer, and from the perspective of modern society, you only live once, therefore you should enjoy every minute of it. Happiness has been equated to pleasure and enjoyment. But for us, happiness has been equated to what? Saying no to the self. Why? Because you might have some small suffering in this life, but then you have external pleasure in the next life. And so he says, now he's going to speak about the difference between man and angel. He says, وَالْإِنسَانُ رُتْبَتُهُ فَوْقَ رُتْبَةِ الْبَهَائِمِ. That man, his level is above the level of beasts. Beasts that roam the world and so on and so forth, his level is above them. And he says, لِقُدْرَتِهِ بِنُورِ الْعَقْلِ عَلَى كَسْرِ شَهْوَتِهِ. Why? Because of his ability, due to the light of intelligence, to say no to his desire. When you think about beasts, i.e. four-legged creatures or two-legged creatures that roam the earth, they do not have the ability to say no to their desires. They cannot. They will continue to eat, they will continue to drink, and they will continue to sleep. They do not have the ability to say no, especially certain animals. For example, think of the dog. A dog will eat and continue to eat until it vomits. The dog will not say no to itself. The dog will continue to eat until it vomits. The dog will eat that which is beneficial for it and that which is harmful for it, without differentiation. Whereas for us, man, due to the light of aql, the light of intelligence and capacity to understand, we have the ability to say no to ourselves. And then he says, وَدُونَ رُتْبَةِ الْمَلَائِكَةِ لِاسْتِيلَاءِ الشَّهَوَاتِ عَلَيْهِ. But at the same time, man are lesser, i.e. they have a lower station than angels. Why? Because of the potential of desire overcoming man. And so man is better than beast. Why? Because man can say no to desire. But man is lesser than angel. Why? Because the ability of the desire to overcome man. And then he says, وَكَوْنُهُ مُبْتَلَى بِمُجَاهِدَتِهَا. Likewise, because he is in a state of constant battle and struggle against his desire. That's what life is. Life is a constant battle and struggle against the self. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَعْدَى عَدُوَكَ أو أعدى عدوك نفسك التي بين جنبيك أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. He said, the severest of your enemies is your nafs that is between your two sides. Man is in a constant state of battle with his self, therefore he is lesser than angel from the perspective of desire, but he's better than beast. Why? Because he can say no. But then he says, فَكُلَّ مَنْ هَمَكَ فِي الشَّهَوَاتِ انْحَطَّ إِلَىٰ أَسْفَلِ السَّافِلِينَ. And so every time man engrosses in his desire, indulges in his desire, what happens? He debases himself until he becomes أَسْفَلُ السَّافِلِينَ, the lowest of the low, the most vulgar of the most vulgar, the most degenerate of the most degenerate. And is that not what we're seeing today? We're seeing that today. To the extent that man has in fact, in some instances, become worse than beast. The cows do not do some of the things that men today do. The cows have not become perverted in their desires the way that mankind has become perverted. Likewise, dogs. Sometimes it's an insult to the animals to compare man to animal. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, when referring to mankind, giving the analogy that they are like al-baha'im, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلْ. In fact, they are worse. They are more lost than the beasts. Predatory animals, they only kill when they are hungry, except for one or two animals. They kill for sport. Other animals, they kill when they are hungry. Man kills for fun. They eat and they are content with that which they eat. The same thing every day. Beasts. Man, no. He has perverted his desire and now he needs something new every day. Beasts understand the concept of intimacy, and they are intimate for the sake of creation. Man has become perverted in his desire. Intimacy now is about pleasure. And man has engaged in so much pleasure of intimacy that now he has perverted his desire to a degree that even humans are not enough. Some people have become so sick that humans are not enough to satisfy their desires. This is what's happening. Why? Because we have cut ourselves away from what? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from the God-given framework, which is the manuscript on how to live life as man in this earth. So he says, وَالْتَحَقَ بِغِمَارِ الْبَهَائِمِ. So he says, فَكُلَّ مَنْ هَمَكَ في الشهوات انحط إلى أسفل السافلين والتحق بغمار البهائم. Every time he engages and indulges in his desire, he debases himself and degrades himself until he becomes amongst the ranks of the beasts. And take note, this was written over roughly 1,000 years ago. Today, we've even separated ourselves from the ranks of the beasts and we become worse than them in many instances. Then he says, وَكُلَّمَا قَمَعَ الشَّهَوَاتِ ارتفع إلى أعلى عليين والتحق بأفق الملائكة. And every time he overcomes his desires, he suppresses himself, he takes control of himself, he raises himself up and he joins the ranks of the angels. He joins the ranks of the angels. And that's what fasting is supposed to be about. He says, وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ مُقَرَّبُونَ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ وَالَّذِي يَقْتَدِي بِهِمْ يَتَشَبَّهُ بِأَخْلَاقِهِمْ يَقْرُبُ مِنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ كَقُرْبِهِمْ. He says, and the angels are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so every time a person follows in the footsteps of the angels, he gains closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as the closeness of the angels to Allah azza wa jal. And then he says, وَلَيْسَ الْقُرْبُ ثَمَّ بِالْمَكَانِ بَلْ بِالصِّفَاتِ. He says that the closeness here is not in relation to place, but in relation to characteristics and qualities of a person. And then he says, وَإِذَا كَانَ هَذَا سِرُّ الصَّوْمِ عِنْدَ أَرْبَابِ الْأَلْبَابِ وَأَصْحَابِ الْقُلُوبِ فَأَيُّ جَدْوَى لِتَأْخِيرِ أَكْلَةٍ وَجَمْعِ أَكْلَتَيْنِ عِنْدَ الْعِشَاءِ مع الانهماك في الشهوات الأخرى طول النهار. He says, and so if this is the understanding of the ulama of the hearts, those who have intelligence, they understand the purpose behind fasting, which is what? To raise yourself above yourself, to battle against your desire, to learn how to say no, to abstain from this worldly life. If they understand this, then they understand there is no benefit in simply delaying your food until after Maghrib or missing out on 2 meals whilst throughout the day you're engaging in haram. What's the point? It's like the person who is going to the gym but eating junk food all day. You're just wasting your breath in the gym. You're wasting your time and your breath. Why? Because you have to control your diet as well as engage in exercise. Likewise with fasting. There's no point in delaying your food, but yet you are spiritually consuming that which you should not be consuming. It's not going to benefit you. And then he says, وَلَوْ كَانَ لِمِثْلِهِ جَدْوَى فَأَيُّ مَعْنَى لِقَوْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ كَمْ مِنْ صَائِمٍ لَيْسَ مِنْ صَوْمِهِ إِلَّا الْجُوعُ وَالْعَطَشِ. He says, and if this type of practice, i.e. you stop eating at Fajr, you start eating at Maghrib, but throughout the day, you're engaged in haram. If this practice was beneficial, and if this was actually fasting, then it renders the words of the Prophet ﷺ to have no meaning. Which words? The Prophet ﷺ said, there is no benefit for every fasting person except hunger and thirst. I.e., there are some, they only gain from their hunger and from their fasting, hunger and thirst. Why? Because it's not accepted with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's saying, so if the understanding of the fuqaha al-zahir was correct, that you simply need to stop eating and start eating again, and don't take any concern about what you do in the dunya, if that was correct, then it renders the words of the Prophet ﷺ to be meaningless. And of course, that's not the case. And so, likewise, we have to reflect on other aspects of worship with the same kind of perception, same kind of perspective. And of course, we're not fasting right now, except voluntary fasting for those who voluntarily fast. But Ramadan is around the corner. It's 5.5 months or so away. It's not too far away. Only 5.5 months. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to reach it. But the point here that we should really focus on is the position that Allah has given to man. Allah has rendered man better than beast if he can control his desire. Lesser than angel if he is unable to control his desire. But if he is able to control his desire, better than the angels, with a more noble position than the angels. The way that we can gain that position is by using our intelligence to say no to the self. And that's what true intelligence is. Today, the intelligent person is the one who is academically intelligent. But from the Islamic perspective, the intelligent person is the one who understands what dunya is, understands what akhirah is, and has the ability to say no to the self and to follow the framework of Islam, even if he is not academically intelligent. And therefore, a simple-minded person who is following the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala properly and is not indulging in his desires is far better than the sharp-minded person who is not following the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is unable to say no to the self. That's the Quranic perspective on life. And we have to challenge the way that we look at life today, because the way that we look at life has been conditioned by our surroundings. We read the Quran, but we don't use the Quran as a way to look at life. In some instances, Wallahu al-Musta'an, we use life to look at the Quran, i.e. we look at the Quran based upon the perspective of our society. For example, some people will talk about human rights and challenge the rights that Allah has given from the perspective of modern human rights. Who gave man the right to determine his own rights? No, Allah determines our rights for us. The man has the rights given to him by Allah. The woman has the rights given to her by Allah. The children have the rights given to them by Allah. The leaders have the rights given to them by Allah, and the followers have the rights given to them by Allah. That's the way we should look at things. We challenge society's perspective based upon what Allah has told us, not the other way around. And we have to think very, very carefully about the way that we engage every day with this dunya. Why? Because society has conditioned us, generally speaking, to engage in this dunya with a very capitalistic understanding. And pleasure is at the core. Pleasure is at the center. Happiness is my goal. But is happiness achievable in this life? Is happiness something we can achieve? Happiness from the modern understanding of happiness. What does that even mean? If you look at Ahlu Gaza, for example, are they happy? Not now, but in the akhirah, they're going to be from the happiest. As for us, perhaps some of us were happy materialistically, but in the akhirah, we're not going to be from the happiest. And so we have to read the Quran and understand life through the lens of Quran. And we conclude with that, inshallah. We have one last section that we'll finish next week, bi'idhnillah, and then we move on to Asrarul Hajj. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.